Welcome to Echoing Tales, where horror lingers and mysteries whisper. Subscribe for chilling stories, true crime, and the eerie unknown. Now turn down the lights and let's step into the story.
Morning light spilled across the marble floors of the palace, bright and golden, yet unable to warm the air in the council chamber, where a ring of men sat in tense silence, their eyes darting between each other as though every word might be overheard by walls themselves. The kingmaker, draped in the deep crimson robes of his office, stood at the head of the table, his fingers pressed together, his gaze heavy as stone. Around him, the kinsmen, uncles, cousins, and distant blood of the throne, leaned in close, speaking not aloud but in whispers, voices low and quick, as if the fate of the realm could shatter beneath the weight of sound. Beyond the thick cedar doors, the people were already murmuring in the streets. Rumors had been carried like dust on the wind for weeks, that the king had taken to his bed and could not rise, that his breath came harsh and ragged, that the cough which racked his frame did not leave him even in the dark hours of the night. Some claimed they had heard it for themselves, a wet, tearing sound in the still of dawn, echoing from the highest chambers of the palace. "It is the uncertainty that makes the people restless," said Lord Mbeku, one of the oldest of the king's cousins, his deep-lined face set in permanent disapproval. "They do not know if there is an heir, and neither, it seems, do we." His words came sharp but hushed, for even here, among the most trusted, there was no safety in being overheard. The kingmaker's eyes narrowed. "That is because his majesty has never spoken it plainly. For years he has ruled without naming a successor, without presenting a son before the kingmakers. Some say it is because he has none. Others, he let the sentence hang, letting its weight fall upon the table like a stone in water. Others say the truth is kept hidden." Lord Zore shifted in his chair. "Hidden? For what purpose? An heir secures peace. Without one, the vultures will circle." A murmur of agreement moved through the room, though none dared raise their voices above the muted hum. "Purpose or not," Lord Mbeku said, "the sickness grows worse. Every day, the palace physician leaves with his head lowered. This morning, I saw him carry away a basin of bloodied cloth. That image hung in the air like smoke." The kingmaker stepped closer to the table, his crimson sleeve brushing the carved edge. "We must speak frankly, even if the truth tastes bitter. If the king dies without a named heir, the crown does not simply pass to the next man of blood. No, it becomes a prize to be fought over. We all know what that means. It meant factions. It meant war. It meant the tearing apart of a kingdom that had known 30 years of relative peace." Lord Zore leaned forward. "Do you believe the rumors? That there is a son? Or that there is not?" The kingmaker paused, looking from face to face. "I believe only what I have seen, and I have never seen such a child." Outside, a sudden cough rang faintly down the marble hall, the sound carrying into the chamber like the cry of some wounded creature. It came in sharp bursts, broken by gasps for air, until it dwindled into silence. All eyes turned to the heavy door. "That is what the people hear," Lord Mbeku said grimly. "That is what they fear." One of the younger kinsmen, his voice trembling, spoke for the first time. "If the people lose faith, they will not wait for the crown to name itself. They will choose their own ruler." The kingmaker's jaw tightened. "Which is why we must act. If there is no heir, we must be ready to guide the throne. If there is one, we must know who he is and whether he can rule." "Do you think the king will tell you?" Lord Zore asked, his tone halfway between curiosity and doubt. "I think," the kingmaker said, "that we have little time to find out. The cough worsens. The fever rises. And if the dawn comes when the king does not wake, the sun will rise over a kingdom already in flames." The council chamber fell into silence again, each man staring at the polished table as if it might offer an answer. Somewhere beyond the walls, the cough returned, softer this time, but no less telling. The sound of mortality creeping ever closer. The whispers from the council chamber were not meant for her ears. Yet in the palace, secrets had a way of finding their way to the queen. Servants moved like water through these corridors, carrying trays and folded linens, but also carrying words, fragments of sentences overheard while refilling goblets or stoking fires. By the time the queen returned from her morning prayers, she knew enough. The kingmaker and the kinsmen had been speaking of succession. She stood in the long gallery outside her private rooms, sunlight pouring through the latticed windows, and tried to still the sudden quickness of her breath. Succession. A word heavy with consequence. Heavier still when the king still lived. Yet what else could they speak of, when her husband's cough rattled the very air and his nights were spent in fevered half-sleep? The queen moved to the window, watching the gardens below where a pair of young pages crossed the gravel paths, their heads bent in low conversation. Even there, she thought, the rumors ran like wildfire. It was not the sickness alone that worried her. It was the uncertainty. No one knew if the king had a son. No one knew if the future had been decided. That void, she understood, could swallow a kingdom whole. She folded her hands before her, forcing her shoulders to remain straight, her chin high. Whatever storm raged within her, it could not be shown. A queen could not afford to look afraid, not when the eyes of the court and the city beyond searched for cracks in the crown. And yet the question gnawed at her. If the kingmaker and the kinsmen could not be certain of an heir, what might they do? The kingmaker was loyal, yes, but loyalty was a frail thing when power hung in the air like ripe fruit ready to be taken. Kinsmen had raised banners against their own blood before. A royal coup was not unthinkable, and if they believed the royal line to be ending, they might already be preparing their claims. She turned from the window and began to pace the length of her chamber, her slippered steps soundless against the woven rugs. She would need to act carefully. Too much secrecy would breed more suspicion, yet too much openness might invite challenges. The people, restless as they were, must be reminded that the crown still held its strength. The advisors must be calmed before their anxieties became ambition. But above all, she must ensure that no move could be made against her husband while he still lived, or against her, should he die. Her mind began to move through the pieces on the board. The few allies she trusted, the messengers she could send quietly to gauge the temper of the city, the court appearances she could arrange to show herself unshaken. She would visit her husband publicly, perhaps letting the court see her at his side. If they saw her as steadfast, the crown might seem less vulnerable. A soft knock at the door broke her thoughts. A lady in waiting entered, bowing low. "Your Majesty," she said softly, "the physician leaves the king's chambers." The queen's gaze lingered on the woman's lowered head. She wondered what the physician had seen, and whether he had already carried his report to the kingmaker. "Send word to my steward," the queen said at last. "There will be a gathering in the great hall this evening. The people must be reminded who holds the crown." Her voice was calm, but in her chest her heart beat hard. She could not control her husband's cough. She could not stop the whispers, but she could shape how the kingdom saw its queen. And in times such as these, perception was as sharp a weapon as any blade. That night, the palace lay under a deep, muffled stillness. The distant hum of the city had faded, replaced by the sigh of wind through the upper windows and the occasional creak of the old beams in the roof. In the royal bedchamber, the air was thick with the faint scent of burning herbs, the physician's latest attempt to ease the king's breathing. The dim light of an oil lamp cast a warm circle over the bed, where the king lay propped against a mound of cushions, his skin pale beneath the dark line of his beard. A cough broke from his chest, low at first, then rising into a fit that shook his frame. The queen was at his side instantly, placing a steadying hand on his arm, her other hand holding the goblet of warm, spiced water the physician had left. When the cough eased, he took it from her with a trembling hand and drank, his gaze on her face. "You look at me," he said, his voice rough but edged with faint amusement, "as though I were already halfway gone." She forced a smile, though it did not reach her eyes. "You are still here. That is all that matters tonight." The king set the goblet down with care, leaning back into the pillows. "But we both know why your eyes are restless. The whispers." She said nothing at first, tracing the carved edge of the bedpost with her fingertips. Finally, she met his gaze. "The kingmaker and the kinsmen are uneasy." The people have begun to wonder who will rule if she stopped herself, unwilling to finish the sentence aloud. If I die, he said, the words blunt and unflinching. Let us speak truth, wife. The air in this palace grows thick with it, and pretending otherwise is a waste of breath. She hesitated. They want to know if there is an heir. A shadow crossed his face. There is not, and they will not make one of our daughter. The firmness in his tone left no space for argument, yet the queen could not help but press. She is of royal blood. She is intelligent, respected among the court. Why should her being our daughter make her unfit to rule? Because it is not our way, the king said, his voice low but iron. No woman has ever worn the crown in her own right. It would be seen as weakness, a break from the strength of our line. The kinsmen would tear the realm apart rather than kneel to her. You know this as well as I. The queen's hands tightened in her lap, and yet you would sooner see the crown in the hands of no one at all than place it with a capable heir. I would sooner see it buried than passed to someone outside our blood. He replied sharply, before a cough stole the rest of his words. He turned away, coughing into a cloth, and when he lowered it, there was the faint, dark stain of blood. She looked at it, but said nothing, her face composed though her stomach tightened. They will not wait forever, she said quietly. If they believe the line is ending, they will choose for themselves. And once they do, the crown will be theirs, not ours. That is why you must hold them, he said, leaning forward slightly, his eyes fixed on hers. Not with promises, not with concessions, with presence. You must show them the royal house is not broken, even if they suspect the truth. But you will not promise them our daughter. You will not let them bring in some cousin from the edges of the family to rule in our name. That would be worse than losing the crown altogether. It would be shame. It would be surrender. She felt the weight of his words settle in her chest, a burden she could not set down. The choice he demanded of her was one that could break the kingdom as surely as it could preserve it. And if the choice is between shame and ruin, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Then you choose ruin, he said without hesitation. For a moment, the only sound was the faint hiss of the oil lamp and the king's uneven breathing. The queen reached for his hand, feeling the frailty of it, the bones too close to the skin. He squeezed her fingers weakly, but the grip carried the last of his resolve. She did not tell him how the kingmaker had looked that morning, or how the kinsmen's voices had carried the quiet hunger of men already tasting the possibility of power. She did not tell him of her fear that if he died, she would be left not as a queen, but as a piece on their board, to be moved or removed as they wished. Instead, she simply said, "Rest now. Tomorrow will come soon enough." But as she lay beside him in the dim light, listening to the uneven rhythm of his breathing, she knew tomorrow would not bring answers, only harder questions. 3 days had passed since the night the king's breathing slowed into stillness and never rose again. The news had not been announced to the people immediately. The queen had kept it within the palace walls, knowing that the moment the death was made public, the kingdom's grip on order would begin to slip. But word had a way of finding cracks, and she could already hear the murmurs in the marketplace and see the unease in the servants' eyes. The queen sat in her private study, the doors barred, the heavy curtains drawn against the light. On the table before her, a lacquered box held the royal seal that would be used to mark the king's death on parchment. Her hand hovered over it, but she pulled back. Not yet. First, she needed her daughter. With a deep breath, she reached for the polished brass receiver of the palace's long-distance line. The faint hiss of connection carried across the seas until, after several moments, her daughter's voice came through, clear, warm, and full of life, until it caught on the first words the queen spoke. "He's gone," the queen said softly. There was a long silence, broken only by the distant sound of gulls from her daughter's end of the call. Then came a sharp inhale. "No, no, mother, you can't mean." "In his sleep," the queen said, her voice holding steady though her hand trembled. "It was peaceful. The physician says it was his heart." Her daughter's voice cracked. "I wasn't here. I wasn't even here to say goodbye." The queen closed her eyes for a moment. "There was nothing you could have done, but you must come home. Now, I'll leave tonight, the daughter said, her words quick with urgency. Mother, the queen cut her off gently. Listen to me. We must act swiftly. The kinsmen are restless. The people are afraid. They believe the royal house is broken, that there is no one left to lead. There was a pause. But, you know they will not let me take the crown. Father would never. I know, the queen said sharply, and then her gaze shifted across the study. In the corner, rolled and tucked into a stand, was a map of the kingdom, a ceremonial copy, its parchment painted with gold leaf. Her eyes lingered on it, on the way the painted borders curved and the mountain ranges stretched. And in that moment, something stirred in her mind, a thought so daring it made her pulse quicken. Unless, she murmured to herself. Unless what? Her daughter asked warily. The queen rose and crossed to the map, pulling it free from its stand and letting it fall open across the desk. She ran her fingers over the jagged mountain crest that bordered the north, over the rivers and cities that belonged to their line. They will not kneel to a queen, she said slowly, but they would kneel to a king. A young king, returned from his travels. One they believed was hidden for his own safety. Her daughter's voice sharpened. Mother, what are you suggesting? You will come home, the queen said, her eyes fixed on the map as though it were a game board. But not as yourself. You will come as the son they believe exists. You will be him. There was a beat of stunned silence on the line. Then her daughter spoke, each word heavy with disbelief. You want me to pretend to be a man? To wear the crown as someone else entirely? Yes. The queen's voice was firm now. You have your father's height. Your features could pass. With the right training, the right presentation, it can be done. It must be done. No, her daughter said at once, anger flaring in her tone. No, this is madness. This is not a game of costumes. If they find out, the queen interrupted, her voice like steel, we lose everything. Do you understand? The kinsmen will take the crown for themselves. We will be cast out, stripped of title, perhaps even exiled. This castle will not be ours. Our name will be reduced to a whisper in the history books. That is the future if we do nothing. Her daughter's breath was shaky through the line. And you would rather have me live a lie? I would rather have you live as a king than see us all live as nothing, the queen said, leaning heavily on the desk. It is not the life I wanted for you. It is not the life your father would have chosen. But he left us no choice. You are the only one who can keep the crown from falling into the wrong hands. For a long time, there was no reply. The queen could hear the faint sound of the sea at her daughter's end, the muted voices of distant passers-by. Finally, the voice came back, low and resigned. When I arrive, we will talk about the details. The queen let out a slow breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Good. I will arrange for your return. And remember, from the moment you step foot on our soil, you are no longer my daughter. You are the king they have been waiting for. As she replaced the receiver, she stared down at the map still spread before her, its gold lines catching the lamplight. Somewhere deep inside, she felt the first stirrings of something she had not allowed herself since the king's death. Not hope, exactly, but resolve. The queen wasted no time. With the receiver barely settled back in its cradle, she rang the silver bell on her desk. Within moments, her chief servant, Olam, stepped into the room, bowing low. Summon the kingmaker and every kinsman to the council chamber, she instructed, her voice smooth but carrying an edge of steel. They are to be here before the last bell of evening. No excuses. Olam glanced up briefly, eyes flickering with the unspoken question everyone carried these days, but he merely bowed again and withdrew. The sun had begun its slow descent by the time the council chamber filled. The air inside was heavy with anticipation and suspicion, the kind that made every glance sharp and every breath measured. The kingmaker stood at the head of the table, crimson robes catching the fading light from the tall windows, while the kinsmen gathered in their appointed seats. The queen entered last, every step deliberate, her black mourning robes flowing behind her. She did not wait for the murmurs to fade before speaking. My lords, she began, her voice calm, but carrying enough strength to silence the room. You have been summoned tonight to hear what has not yet been told beyond these walls." The kingmaker's dark eyes studied her, his hands clasped in front of him. "Your Majesty," he said slowly, "we await your word." The queen let the pause draw out, feeling the weight of the moment settle on every man in the room. Then she spoke. "The king has passed on." A ripple of movement went through the chamber, heads bowing slightly, lips pressing together, but no gasps. They had all suspected it already. She continued before they could respond. "But before you ask the question you have been whispering among yourselves for months, I will answer it. There is an heir, a son. He has lived overseas for his safety, away from the intrigues of the court. He has been informed of his father's passing, and he will return home to take his rightful place as prince and fulfill his royal duties." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Then the questions began, low but pressing. "A son? Hidden from the council?" One kinsman demanded, his thick brows drawing together. "Why was this kept from us?" Another asked, his voice half outrage, half disbelief. Even the kingmaker's steady voice carried a note of curiosity. "Your Majesty, the birth of an heir is not a small thing. The kingdom should have celebrated it. Why would the king conceal such a truth from his own advisors?" The queen's gaze swept over them, meeting each man's eyes in turn. "Because it was a matter of family, not politics. The king did what was necessary to protect his blood. He owed no explanation for his choices, nor do I owe one to you now." A murmur passed between the kinsmen, but none dared press too hard. They were treading on dangerous ground, and she had given them no opening to push through. The queen stepped closer to the table, her voice cooling further. "What matters is this: the prince lives. He has been informed. He will return soon to carry out his duties, to stand before the people, and to prove that the royal line remains unbroken. This is the only truth the kingdom needs to know." The kingmaker studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "And when will this prince arrive?" "Soon," she said simply, the finality in her tone making it clear that was all she intended to reveal. The chamber fell into a taut stillness. The kinsmen shifted in their seats, their minds already working through what this meant for their ambitions. Some wore the tight smiles of men masking disbelief. Others looked wary, as though weighing whether to challenge her openly. But none did. "If there are no further questions," the queen said, straightening, "we are finished here." The kingmaker inclined his head in a gesture that was part respect, part calculation. "As you say, your Majesty." She turned and swept from the room, without waiting for the murmurs to resume. Outside the chamber, the air felt cooler, freer, though she knew it was an illusion. Inside, she had planted a seed, one that would either grow into her salvation or unravel her entirely. In the coming days, the kinsmen would whisper in doubt, the kingmaker would watch her more closely, and the people would hunger for the first sight of their prince. All of it was a dangerous dance, but it was one she had chosen. And as she walked the long corridor back to her chambers, she thought of her daughter, still far from home, and the impossible role that awaited her. The prince's arrival was nothing like the triumphant homecoming the queen had announced. It was silent, veiled, and shrouded in secrecy. Her daughter came not through the main gates, but by a hidden service road, her carriage covered in dust from the long journey. The guards stationed there were handpicked by the queen herself, men whose loyalty she had tested over years and whose tongue she knew would remain still. It was night when they entered the palace grounds. The queen was waiting in the shadows of the old orchard behind the west wing, far from the prying eyes of courtiers and servants. She embraced her daughter briefly, though even that moment of warmth was wrapped in tension. "We have no time," the queen murmured. "Follow me." They moved quickly, avoiding the lit corridors and bustling kitchens, passing instead through narrow back staircases and servants' halls. Finally, they came to an abandoned suite deep in the east wing, a place in use since the days of the queen's grandmother, where the air was cool and the windows looked out over nothing but overgrown gardens. Inside, a single lamp burned, its glow falling on a table strewn with brushes, powders, jars of pigments, strips of false hair, and carefully shaped prosthetics. Waiting beside it was a man in plain clothes, his eyes sharp and assessing. "This is Nuru," the queen said. "An artist of faces. There is no one better." Nuru bowed slightly, though his gaze was already moving over the daughter's features, studying the angles of her jaw, the line of her brow. "I understand the task," he said simply. The queen stepped closer to him. "Not merely a disguise," she said in a low voice. "She must not be recognized by anyone who has seen her before. Not family, not old friends, not even the servants. She must become a man in the eyes of the world. Strong, unyielding. A prince." Nuru's lips curved in the faintest smile. "Then it will be done." The queen placed a small velvet pouch on the table. The heavy clink inside spoke for itself, payment far beyond what most men saw in a year. Nuru nodded once, pocketing it without a word. Her daughter's voice broke the silence. "Mother, this is madness," she whispered. The queen met her eyes. "This is survival. Sit." And so the transformation began. Nuru worked with careful, deliberate hands, shadowing her cheeks to hollow them, reshaping her nose with putty, affixing false brows that thickened and darkened her gaze. Strips of hair were applied to her chin and jaw until her face was no longer her own. The daughter caught glimpses of herself in the mirror as the work progressed, each glance showing less of the woman she knew and more of the stranger the world would soon call a prince. The queen stood behind her the entire time, her expression unreadable. Only when the last detail was in place did she speak. "Now," she said softly, "the kingdom will believe." The days that followed were thick with secrecy, a careful dance in which only a chosen handful took part, and in the quiet chambers of the palace the queen's plan unfolded like the slow blooming of a flower whose petals could never be seen in daylight. The daughter, once a shy and soft-spoken young woman whose hands had known only the smoothness of silk, was now awakened each morning before the first horn of the palace guards. Her chambermaids, sworn to silence, would dress her not in flowing gowns, but in the tailored tunics and embroidered trousers reserved for royal sons, the fabric stitched with patterns meant to project authority, strength, and masculine grace. Her long hair was bound away, cut in a manner sharp enough to disguise her true form, and her face, with its fine features, was subtly altered with powdered shading that gave her jaw a faintly harder line. The queen herself oversaw these transformations with the precision of a master artisan. She had been born into politics and intrigue. She knew that survival in a palace was not always a matter of swords and armies. It was often a matter of performance, of creating the right illusion at the right time. She spoke to her daughter in a voice firm but loving, instructing her on how to move with a man's grounded weight, how to walk with the assurance of one who was born to command, and how to speak with a low, steady timbre that neither trembled nor yielded. Beside her, a trusted servant, a man the queen had rewarded with a pouch of gold so heavy he could buy his own small estate, was tasked with drilling the finer arts of courtly behavior into the young woman. This man, who had served the palace since his youth, understood the habits of princes and kings better than most. He taught her how to clasp hands firmly in greeting, how to hold the gaze of elders without deference, and how to use silence as a weapon in a debate. Her days were long and filled with the weight of expectation. In the mornings, she practiced sword handling, not to master the blade, but to learn how to carry it in a way that would convince the kinsmen of her readiness for war if ever called upon. In the afternoons, she sat in the council chamber with the queen, reviewing the protocols of the royal court, memorizing the names of the great clans, their loyalties and rivalries, and the histories that bound or divided them. At night, she rehearsed speeches before the queen, her voice growing firmer with each passing day until the echo in the chamber seemed to belong to someone else entirely. By the end of the week, the transformation was nearly complete. The queen, seeing her daughter now standing tall with her shoulders squared and her head held high, felt the quiet satisfaction of a strategist whose plan was taking shape. Yet beneath her calm smile, the queen understood the risk. If a single kinsman suspected the truth, the palace could descend into chaos, their enemies emboldened to seize power. But she also knew that to hesitate was to invite ruin. The day of the meeting arrived, and the palace was alive with the heavy steps of messengers and the low hum of preparation. The council hall was readied, its great doors polished to a shine, the long table laid with ceremonial cloth. Incense burned slowly from copper braziers, its smoke curling in lazy tendrils toward the high rafters. The kingmakers, men of formidable presence and sharp eyes, entered with the kinsmen in measured procession, their robes heavy with embroidered crests. They took their places, their voices low as they discussed the matter of succession that had weighed heavily on the kingdom since whispers of the king's illness began to spread. The queen entered first, regal and unyielding, her every step a declaration of control. Then came the figure they had all been waiting to see, the supposed prince. The daughter, now clad in deep royal blue trimmed with gold, moved forward with the confidence she had practiced for days. Her hair was short, her bearing commanding, her eyes steady as they swept over the gathered elders. She bowed with the precise measure of respect due to their rank, but with no trace of subservience, then took her place beside the queen. "My lords," the queen began, her voice like tempered steel, "I present to you the heir to the throne, the son you have sought to guide and guard, born of royal blood, ready to bear the crown and the weight of our ancestors." The kinsmen studied the young figure before them, searching for signs of weakness, of youth, of inexperience, but finding none. The servants' training had been flawless, the queen's guidance sharper still. In the deep, measured tone she had practiced, the daughter addressed them, speaking of duty, unity, and the honor of the kingdom. She spoke of the legacy of their forebears, of a need for strength and continuity, her words carrying the weight of rehearsed conviction. Murmurs rippled through the gathering, nods exchanged between kingmakers. What they saw was not a girl disguised, but a prince they could rally behind, a figure who, in their eyes, carried the dignity of the royal line forward. One of the elder kinsmen, his beard streaked with silver, turned to the queen and said, "We are satisfied. The coronation shall be arranged. The people will see that the throne is secure." Relief, warm and quiet, flowed through the queen's chest. The deception had worked, at least for now. She inclined her head in acknowledgement, her expression serene though her heart beat with triumph. Beside her, the daughter, no longer merely her child but now the kingdom's prince, kept her composure though a flicker of pride lit her eyes. She understood what this meant. Their place was preserved, their power intact. The meeting closed with the deep resonance of the ceremonial gavel striking the table, sealing the decision. As the kinsmen departed, the queen allowed herself the smallest of smiles, her hand resting briefly on her daughter's arm. Together they left the hall, the sound of their footsteps carrying the quiet promise of a crown that would, for now, remain in their family's grasp. In the days that followed, the palace became a stage for an elaborate deception, the corridors humming with discreet activity as the queen's plan unfurled with precision and quiet menace. The daughter, slender in frame but with a jawline and poise that, when cloaked in the right garments and disciplined posture, could pass for the absent heir, was subjected to a relentless regimen. Each morning before the sun breached the palace walls, she was roused from her chambers by the queen's most trusted attendants, ushered into a private hall where mirrors stood like silent judges along every wall. There, an old courtier named Baruma, known for training princes in the art of royal bearing, drilled her in the precise way to stand, the measured pace of her walk, the subtle authority in her gaze that could silence a room without a word. Her voice was another matter entirely. Naturally softer, melodic, but through hours of repetition under the guidance of a grizzled voice coach, she learned to speak in a lower register, each word measured, deliberate, touched with the kind of quiet command expected from a king's blood. She learned the stories of the years abroad that the queen had crafted for the false prince, a web of plausible travels and political tutelage that could withstand even the most probing questions. The names of foreign dignitaries, fabricated military campaigns, and embellished tales of diplomatic missions were committed to memory until they rolled off her tongue with the ease of lived experience. Clothing was no less important in the transformation. Tailors worked tirelessly, draping her in flowing robes of deep gold and crimson, their weight lending her the presence of a monarch in waiting. Jewel-studded sashes were fastened at her waist, and a heavy ceremonial chain was placed around her neck to accustom her to the regalia she would wear on the coronation day. In public appearances within the palace, she carried herself with a practiced detachment, offering polite nods to visitors, keeping her words minimal but pointed, the perfect impression of a royal son recently returned. To the majority of the kinsmen and kingmakers, the ruse held. They saw what they expected to see: the king's long-awaited heir, shaped by foreign lands into a man of purpose, now ready to inherit the throne. Smiles and handclasps were offered, words of loyalty pledged in anticipation of the coronation that loomed just a week away. But there was one among them, Okoye, the king's elder cousin, who could not let the matter rest. He was a man with a sharp eye and a sharper instinct, known for speaking little but seeing much. When he looked at the supposed prince, he did not see a returning heir. He saw a stranger whose mannerisms felt studied, whose eyes darted with the faintest flicker of caution whenever conversation strayed too far from the rehearsed tales. Each time the kinsmen gathered in the great hall, Okoye lingered a little longer after the formalities, watching from the edge of the chamber as the prince exchanged measured words with courtiers. He asked quiet questions of the servants, noting that none recalled seeing the heir before his supposed return. He observed the way the queen's presence seemed to wrap around the impostor like a shield, always intercepting direct challenges with a warm but firm hand. And while the others laughed and spoke of the coronation feast, Okoye kept his silence, his suspicions coiling in his mind like smoke, waiting for the right wind to carry them into flame. The queen saw him watching, and though her mask never cracked, she made a silent note. If the plan was to succeed, Okoye would have to be handled carefully and soon. 2 days before the coronation, the palace walls, once echoing only with the steady rhythm of preparations, began to hum with a different kind of energy. Okoye, the man whose suspicion had never wavered, moved quietly among the royal workers. His voice was low, his tone commanding without raising above a whisper, as he summoned the few who were loyal to him. These were men and women who had served the royal family for decades, their loyalty bound more to the bloodline than to any single monarch. "I want your eyes on him," Okoye instructed, not using the word prince. "Watch where he goes, who he speaks to, what he says. Bring me anything, no matter how small, that feels off. This must remain between us." Not a word to the queen. The servants nodded, their faces a mixture of nervousness and intrigue. In their minds, if Okoye's suspicion proved true, they would be remembered as those who stood for truth when all others were deceived. That same afternoon, an invitation arrived at the palace from a nearby township. It was for a community gathering, a celebration to honor the upcoming coronation. The letter was warm and formal, the sort of event where the presence of the future king would reassure the people of the royal family's stability. The queen read it in her study, fingers drumming lightly against the desk. It was a risk. Too many eyes. Too many questions. But refusing could invite just as much suspicion. She summoned her daughter, still dressed as the prince, and fixed her with a sharp, unwavering stare. "You will go," the queen said. "It will strengthen the people's faith. But you must be careful. Smile, speak little, and avoid anything that would reveal who you are. You must be perfect." Her daughter swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the moment, then nodded. The next day, the event unfolded under the golden warmth of the sun. Villagers gathered in a large square, music and laughter filling the air. The prince's arrival was met with cheers, hands raised in welcome. Children offered flowers, elders gave blessings, and local leaders praised his return to the homeland. He moved as he had been trained, measured steps, a regal nod, a small smile that betrayed nothing. But in the crowd, unseen by him, Okoye's loyal servants watched from every corner, memorizing every gesture, every pause, every tone of voice. Some swore they caught the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes when a village matriarch addressed him as "your father's true son." Others noted how he avoided prolonged conversation, as though fearful of slipping from his carefully rehearsed stories. By the time the event ended, whispers had already begun among Okoye's watchers. That evening, their reports reached him. His suspicion hardened into conviction. The following morning, the kingmakers and kinsmen returned to the palace, not with the air of loyal subjects, but as men carrying a burden of truth they intended to reveal. They did not request an audience, they demanded it. In the grand hall, the prince stood at the queen's side as the kinsmen spoke. Their voices were firm, tinged with outrage. "This is no true son of the late king," Okoye declared, his voice resonating through the high chamber. "We have observed him, and his manner is not that of one raised in the traditions of our people. His eyes avoid the truth, and his tongue hesitates over the history of his own father. You hide a stranger beneath that crown." The queen's reaction was swift, her voice slicing through the air like a whip. "How dare you stand in my palace and speak such treachery?" she shouted, stepping forward so her robes flared like the wings of a great bird. "You dare insult the blood of the king, my husband, and dishonor his memory with these baseless lies? Have you no shame?" The kinsmen did not flinch. Their faces were carved with determination, their bodies rigid as spears. "We speak the truth," Okoye said evenly, "and we will not be silenced by your anger. This is not the heir you claim him to be, and we will prove it. The people deserve to know." The queen's eyes narrowed, her voice trembling with controlled fury. "Enough. You poison the air of this palace with your falsehoods. Leave now, before your words condemn you to ruin." Still, the kinsmen did not bend to her authority. They exchanged looks of grim agreement, then turned on their heels. "We are right," Okoye called over his shoulder. "And when the truth is laid bare, the crown will not rest on a pretender's head." Their footsteps echoed down the corridor as they left the palace. The heavy doors closed behind them, the sound reverberating like the crack of distant thunder. Inside the hall, the queen stood motionless for a moment, her heart pounding though her face remained a mask of regal defiance. At her side, her daughter's disguised hands curled into fists beneath the flowing sleeves of royal silk. Neither spoke, but in the silence, they both knew the game had shifted. The threat was no longer in whispers. It was now a promise. Morning broke with a golden light spilling across the palace grounds, the kind of sun that seemed to bless a day meant for history. Inside the royal chambers, the prince was already awake, standing before a tall mirror while attendants fussed over every fold of the ceremonial robes. Golden embroidery caught the light like threads of fire, and the crown, polished to a blinding gleam, waited on a cushion nearby. The air was heavy with the scent of incense and the distant echo of drums from the city beyond the palace gates. The queen entered, her gown sweeping across the marble floor, her face calm, but her eyes burning with a private triumph. She paused to study her child's reflection in the mirror, not as her daughter, but as the figure the world now believed to be the rightful heir to the throne. "All has gone according to plan," she said, her voice low and deliberate. "Today, we complete the story we began. Once you are crowned, you will rule in your father's name until the people no longer question your right to the crown." Then, she allowed herself a small, victorious smile. "They will accept it as natural that you should remain king forever." Her daughter swallowed hard, still adjusting to the enormity of it all. She had mastered the walk, the voice, the mannerisms. She had survived the suspicious stares of Okoye and his allies. But today was different. Today the eyes of the entire kingdom would be upon her. The queen touched her shoulder firmly. "You will carry this crown with pride. Remember, every step you take today is one closer to securing our family's place forever." The great bells began to toll across the palace, signaling the start of the coronation. The throne room glittered with golden light, packed with nobles, foreign envoys, and the highest ministers of the land. The kingmakers and kinsmen lined the walls, their expressions unreadable. Music filled the air, solemn and grand, and the prince began the long walk down the aisle toward the throne. Each step echoed on the marble, the air thick with expectation. And then, movement. From the corner of the hall, a figure stepped forward. He wore a hood pulled low over his face, his movements sharp and deliberate. In one smooth motion, he reached beneath his cloak, and the glint of steel flashed in the air. Gasps tore through the crowd. A gunshot split the music like lightning tearing the sky. The prince staggered, a look of stunned disbelief on her face, and then she fell to the ground, her robes pooling around her in a sudden, terrible stillness. Screams erupted. Nobles dove for cover. Guards surged forward, tackling the hooded man as he tried to flee. The gun clattered across the marble floor. "Protect the heir!" Voices shouted over the chaos. But then came the queen's voice, sharp, desperate, cutting through everything. "Save my daughter!" she cried, dropping to her knees beside the fallen figure. Her hands clutched at the blood seeping into the ceremonial robes, her face a mask of horror. "Don't just stand there. Save her!" The words froze those close enough to hear. "Daughter?" The kingmakers and kinsmen exchanged stunned glances. Confusion rippled through them like a wave. But the guards and medics, driven by duty rather than curiosity, lifted the wounded prince and rushed her out of the throne room. The queen remained where she was, trembling, her gown stained with her child's blood, the echoes of the gunshots still ringing in her ears. Okoye, standing among the kinsmen, felt the corners of his mouth tighten, not in satisfaction, but in grim confirmation. The truth had slipped free, not through investigation, but in the heat of a mother's terror. The throne room was in disarray, guests arguing, guards shouting orders, the scent of smoke and gunpowder mingling with the fading incense. And as the queen rose, her eyes hardening even in grief, she knew two things with absolute clarity. They had not only lost the illusion of the prince today, they had invited a storm that might well destroy the crown entirely. A heavy silence settled over the palace in the days after the shooting. The queen's daughter had been rushed back to their private chambers under the strictest guard, the halls buzzing with hushed whispers and swirling rumors. Among them, an unexpected whisper took root, that the young prince was with child. The rumor spread quickly, a flicker of hope in a time shadowed by grief. But it was soon eclipsed by darker news. The injuries proved too severe. The royal heir, the daughter who had borne the crown in disguise, had died. The queen's world crumbled. In the grand hall, where she once stood resolute, now she moved like a ghost, her eyes hollow with loss. The kingmakers and kinsmen came bearing condolences, their faces a mixture of sorrow and restrained anger. In private, their voices were harsher. "Your deception cost us dearly," one whispered. "We trusted your word, yet you brought us a lie." Another muttered, "This has weakened the crown's legacy. The people will question us all now." Despite their fury, they recognized the queen's grief and chose their words with care, aware that the kingdom itself was vulnerable. Hours later, the queen summoned the court and the people to the great hall. Her voice, though weary, carried the weight of a monarch who must face the truth. She announced the death of the prince, spoke of the tragedy with measured grace, and vowed that the royal line would endure, that the crown would never fall. It was a moment heavy with finality, yet brimming with unspoken promise. The kingdom held its breath, waiting to see what would come next. The great throne room of Umudike was packed to its gilded rafters. Kingmakers, kinsmen, elders, and common citizens alike gathered beneath the soaring ceiling carved with ancestral symbols. The air was thick with tension and a restless murmur, as if the very stones held their breath. At the center, the queen stood alone upon the raised dais, the weight of a kingdom pressing down on her slender shoulders. Her face was pale, but her voice rang clear and unwavering as she prepared to speak to the people she had both deceived and sought to protect. "My beloved Umudike," she began, her tone measured yet heavy with sorrow. "I come before you not with the pride of the victorious monarch, but with the humility of a mother and servant to this land." She paused, the silence amplifying every heartbeat. "You have been misled, by me, by the story of the prince who was not what he seemed. I have hidden the truth, desperate to keep our kingdom whole, to hold fast to the crown that has long been our heritage. Gasps rippled through the crowd, voices rising in shock and anger. Why deceive us? A voice called from the back. Why keep secrets that have brought only pain and confusion? The queen nodded, acknowledging the hurt she had sown. Because the traditions that have bound us for centuries have not always served us well. The king left no son. And so, in fear that chaos would rip our people apart, I forged a path I thought necessary, though flawed. Her gaze swept over the crowd, searching their faces. We must face change. The world is not what it was, and neither can our kingdom remain frozen in the past. The crown must no longer be bound by blood alone. At first, the murmurs grew to discontent, some voices loud with disbelief, others cold with suspicion. This is betrayal, someone shouted. The throne belongs to the royal bloodline, no matter what. But slowly, as the queen spoke of unity, of the need to rebuild with honesty and strength, a quiet ripple of understanding began to thread through the crowd. Some nodded. Elders whispered to one another. Mothers clutched their children closer. The queen's words, though bitter, struck chords of truth that could no longer be ignored. Yet not all were swayed. The kingmakers and kinsmen, standing with rigid postures along the hall's sides, exchanged grim glances. Their faces betrayed anger deeper than disappointment, a fury that burned like embers beneath polished stone. After the queen's departure, the council convened behind closed doors, their voices heavy with judgment. This deception has brought shame upon the throne, Okoye intoned, his voice cold as granite. She has fractured the trust of the gods and the people alike. Such treachery cannot go unpunished. The kingmaker's decision was swift and merciless. The queen was to be stripped of her title, her name removed from the scrolls of royalty, and she was to be banished from Umudike forever. A living exile, cast beyond the borders of the kingdom she once ruled in all but name. The gods will cleanse this wound with her departure, Okoye declared, and the anger she has drawn upon us will fade only when the rightful line is restored. But who would claim the throne? The kinsmen turned to the ancient scrolls and lineage records. They pronounced that the royal bloodline of Umudike had ended with the late king and his daughter, and thus the crown must pass to another noble family. The Abadike family, known for their honorable lineage and strength. The announcement was made with great ceremony the following dawn. In the great hall, draped in solemn banners, the herald proclaimed, "Hear ye all! By decree of the kingmakers and kinsmen, the crown of Umudike is passed henceforth to the house of Abadike. The queen, having severed her bond with the throne through deception, is banished and cast beyond our lands. May this new reign bring the peace and honor our kingdom deserves." Shock and murmurs cascaded through the gathering, some faces brightening at the prospect of new leadership, others heavy with loss and uncertainty. The queen, watching from afar, felt the cold finality settle like winter's frost around her heart. In the days that followed, the streets of Umudike thrummed with speculation. Some grieved the queen's fall, others welcomed the change. The kinsmen stood watchful and stern, determined to restore order and guard against any further upheaval. But as the queen's footsteps faded beyond the kingdom's borders, a whisper stirred among the people. A question of what future awaited Umudike without the blood that had once worn the crown, and whether the true strength of a kingdom lay in its lineage or in the spirit of its people. And so, a new chapter began, not just for a family, but for a kingdom on the edge of transformation, where old traditions clashed with the promise of a different dawn. Thank you for watching Echoing Tales. Subscribe, ring the bell, like and share. Stay tuned, because the next mystery is already calling.